Welcome back to Sip&Talk. I'm Joe.
And I'm Sunny. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world.
Welcome, welcome. All right, so I have to share this. I was scrolling the other day and I stumbled across this. This incredibly brutal take on China. Someone actually said, if a foreign power wanted to plant an agent to bring down China, they couldn't pick a better person than the man at the top right now.
Wow.
I know, right? When I saw that, I thought, man, that is more savage than anything an AI could come up with.
And by the man at the top, we're talking about, well, we know who we're talking about.
We do. And look, obviously, a statement like that is, it's high-level political satire, it's hyperbole. But it got me thinking, why is that idea getting so much traction?
Well, it's because some critics are looking at the last decade, at the decisions on the economy, on foreign policy, and they're judging by the results.
And the results.
Yeah.
They look a lot like self-inflicted wounds.
Exactly. So that's what we need to unpack today. Which policies make people confuse national strategy with, well, national self-sabotage? Right. And I'm really curious about this whole philosophy of stability above all else, or, face is more important than profit, and this intense concentration of power. Is that genuinely a flawed approach, or is it just something that outsiders like us can't really grasp?
That's the billion-dollar question.
So here's the plan. We're going to break down why critics are using this foreign agent analogy. We'll look at the specific policies seen as draining the country's strength and how China itself views the trade-off between strategy and cost.
And then the big one.
We're going to get into that super sensitive question that's on everyone's mind. In the next 3 years, could China's economy actually face a total collapse?
Don't worry, we'll ease you into it. We're not going to cause a meltdown right at the start.
Exactly. To put it simply, today's topic is really about how fine the line is between making a country strong and, well, running it into the ground.
Sounds fascinating. I'm willing to sit back with my drink and listen very carefully.
Hey, I knew that wasn't coffee in your mug today. You've been watching too many of Micky's wine tasting videos, haven't you? All right, let's get into this.
Let's do it.
So, section 1. Let's start with this whole paradox of centralization, power versus prosperity.
Okay, so first things first, let's just clarify this. Agent of hostile forces critique. It is so important to understand this is not a literal claim. No one is saying there's actual espionage going on.
Right, it's not a spy movie. It's a political metaphor, a weaponized piece of satire.
A weapon used mostly by, overseas Chinese dissidents, media outlets, foreign policy commentators. It's designed to make a point in the sharpest way possible.
And the logic behind it is purely based on the results, right? It's a result-based analysis.
100%. The stated intention of a policy, let's say achieving political supremacy or zhengzi guoshui, it becomes totally irrelevant if the outcome, the thing you can actually see and measure, is your own economy slowing down and your strategic rivals gaining an advantage.
So if your policies end up, say, scaring away global talent and investment and isolating you on the world stage, it doesn't matter what you meant to do.
Exactly. Functionally, you are doing the work of a hostile foreign agent for them. And this whole critique, it really came into focus because of this massive shift away from the old Dengist model.
The pragmatic model, the whole hide your strength, bide your time philosophy. That was all about one thing: economic growth.
It was a very clear social contract. The party gets to keep absolute political control, but in exchange, they have to deliver a better standard of living year after year after year. That was their performance legitimacy.
But that contract seems to have been fundamentally rewritten.
It has. The new system, it very explicitly prioritizes absolute control for the party and, this is the really critical part, the leader's personal prestige, quanli yumianzi, over actual concrete economic health for the nation, the guomenli.
The political need to secure the system now trumps the economic need to grow the pie.
And if you're an entrepreneur inside China or a foreign investor looking in, that is a terrifying shift.
Because the rules aren't about the market anymore, they're about political loyalty.
Which brings us right to the core institutional flaw that critics point to. The system has become incredibly rigid. And that rigidity has led to, well, the death of any real course correction mechanism.
Okay, so I remember after the Mao era, they set up this system of collective leadership.
Right.
And the whole point was to stop one person from having too much power to avoid that kind of instability. So when did that start to fall apart? And what does it actually mean, in practice?
It eroded really, really dramatically over the last decade with the move back to this highly personalized style of rule. Analysts have a term for it: political monism.
Political monism?
Yeah, it's the idea that the leader's will and the party's will are the exact same thing, so they can't be challenged. In practice, it means all those old checks and balances, like real debates inside the Politburo Standing Committee or independent advice from the State Council, they've been hollowed out.
So policy isn't something that's debated based on economic reality anymore. It's just a top-down order.
It's a mandate. The State Council, which used to be the main driver of economic policy, now often needs the personal green light from the top leader for any major decision.
And that's not just about showing respect, is it?
No, it's a huge institutional bottleneck. Think about it. The leader's attention is focused on what he sees as the top priorities: national security, anti-corruption, political loyalty. So what happens when a huge economic crisis starts bubbling up, like the local debt bomb or the housing crisis?
It gets stuck in a bureaucratic traffic jam at the very top.
That's it. A decentralized system, like the U.S. Federal Reserve, can react to a financial crisis in hours. But a hyper-centralized system, which is great for building a massive dam, becomes cripplingly slow when you need to be quick and nimble.
And that slowness, that inertia, it makes those historical comparisons people are using feel really potent.
It does. We have to talk about the analogy of Chongzhen, the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty.
Yes. I saw this in the notes. The book, Chongzhen, the diligent ruler who destroyed his nation. And the most telling detail is that it was reportedly pulled from bookshelves almost immediately.
Incredibly telling. Chongzhen was famous for being a workaholic. He was diligent, he was centralized, he never stopped working, and yet his dynasty completely collapsed under the weight of corruption and fiscal crisis because he couldn't get good information and he couldn't change course.
So the book being withdrawn implies that the current leadership sees the parallel.
It suggests the danger is understood. Hard work and centralization are no substitute for good policy. If the mechanisms for honest, unfiltered feedback are gone, you're just executing a flawed plan with maximum efficiency. You're just driving the car faster towards the cliff.
The ultimate warning. Diligence doesn't matter if your GPS is broken. And the biggest wrong turn they seem to be making is this economic self-defeat. They're crippling the very engine that gave them legitimacy in the first place.
You can see the erosion of that performance legitimacy so clearly. I mean, from 1978 to 2012, China's average growth rate was, 9.4% a year.
It's just a staggering number.
It is. And that's what gave the party its mandate. But now, you look at the current situation, low consumer confidence, private investment has stalled, the real estate crisis. That foundation is cracking.
And critics point to one thing in particular as the main act of self-sabotage: the intentional attacks on the private sector.
This is absolutely central to the argument. We've seen a consistent pattern of policies that prop up the state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, which are politically loyal, but let's be honest, they're often inefficient.
While at the same time, they're cracking down on the most dynamic parts of the economy, like tech and finance.
It's a very clear trade. They're prioritizing political loyalty and state control over market efficiency. So if you're a successful entrepreneur in China today, your biggest risk isn't your competitor anymore, it's the government.
Let's get into the specifics because the examples really show how it works. Take the 3 red lines policy for real estate. The goal was to get debt under control, which, everyone agreed was necessary.
A necessary goal, yes.
So why do critics say the way they did it was self-sabotage?
Because the problem wasn't the what, it was the how. Instead of a slow, careful, managed approach, they just dropped a hammer. The policy was applied abruptly, across the board.
One size fits all.
Exactly. And it immediately choked off all liquidity for basically every developer except the absolute healthiest ones. And that led to this cascade of defaults. Evergrande is just the most famous one that then infected the entire financial system. It was like performing radical surgery with a blunt axe.
And what about the regulatory crackdown on the tech giants like Alibaba and Tencent?
Yeah.
And they basically wiped out the entire private tutoring industry overnight.
These moves weren't just about regulation. They sent a chilling message to the entire private sector. No company will be allowed to grow so big or so influential that it could potentially challenge the party's authority.
And then you add in the new national security and anti-espionage laws.
Right. Since 2014, they've expanded these laws so broadly that, doing normal business due diligence, collecting market data, that can now be interpreted as a threat to national security. The combined effect of all of this has been a deep, profound crisis of confidence.
So if you're a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley or a brilliant engineer in Berlin, the political risk of being in China now just outweighs the market opportunity.
That's the argument. And it leads to capital flight and a brain drain. From the agent critique perspective, it's the perfect self-sabotage. You deliberately slow your own innovation, you scare away the money and the talent you need, all in the name of political security.
Which brings us to the ticking time bomb under the whole economy. This fiscal and policy paralysis, specifically with local government debt.
This is a really deep structural problem. You have the central government in Beijing, which collects the majority of the tax revenue, maybe around 70%.
But it pushes most of the spending responsibilities down to the local governments.
Exactly. They expect local governments to hit these ambitious growth targets, provide all the public services, build the infrastructure, but they don't give them enough money to do it.
So the local governments are forced to find money elsewhere. And that means selling land and borrowing huge amounts of money through these off-the-books companies, right? The LGFVs.
The local government financing vehicles. They are the financial black hole of the system. Some estimates put the total government debt, including all this hidden LGFV debt, at close to 300% of GDP.
300%, that's not sustainable.
Not when the primary way to pay it back selling land has basically disappeared because the property market has collapsed.
And the central government knows this is a systemic risk. So why are they so reluctant to just step in with a massive bailout?
It's what economists call moral hazard. Beijing is afraid that if they bail everyone out now, it'll just encourage more reckless borrowing in the future. They're trying to force some discipline. One analyst called it a pressure cooker approach.
But the pressure just keeps building.
It does. Because local governments can't just let millions of people become unemployed. So they default on payments to contractors, but they keep paying salaries and Social Security. So the debt never really goes down. It feels like a classic case of what they call zilly shilling governance failure.
Because the real solutions, the structural reforms, are just too politically difficult.
They're what's called the hard bones of reform. We're talking about fundamental changes here. A nationwide property tax, which would give local governments a stable source of income. Real fiscal decentralization, major tax reform.
But all of those things would mean the central leadership has to give up some of its power.
And that's the one thing they seem unwilling to do, the fact that they're struggling so much to implement these necessary, painful reforms. It's why so many critics have lost faith that the system can fix itself.
Okay, so just to recap Section 1, this drive for centralization has created a rigid system that's scaring the private sector and creating a debt crisis at the local level. Now, let's see what happens when that rigidity meets the outside world.
Right. Section 2 is all about these strategic blunders and the geopolitical backlash. And that starts with wolf warriorism.
Wolf warrior diplomacy. Basically, the policy of prioritizing national face over actual long-term stability and economic interests.
It came directly from the top. There was a directive for Chinese diplomats to show more fighting spirit, to, quote, dare to show their swords. It was meant to project strength.
But the cost has been, it's been pretty devastating for their strategic position, hasn't it?
It really has. This super aggressive posture has led to a measurable, dramatic drop in international public opinion. You look at polls from key partners. In Europe, Australia, Japan, the U.S. trust in China is at historic lows.
So instead of winning friends, it's just alienating the trading partners they need and pushing everyone towards decoupling.
And that's the core failure mechanism from the critic's point of view. You're using your foreign policy to satisfy a domestic need to play to nationalist sentiment, to protect face. But the actions you take to do that end up costing you dearly in the long run.
And we can see that cost in a few really clear case studies of what looks like self-sabotage.
Let's start with the most obvious one. The South China Sea.
The island building.
The massive, rapid militarization of those artificial islands. Building runways, radar domes, missile shelters. That was a very clear choice to impose their will by force, not through negotiation. And then
they completely rejected the International Tribunal ruling in 2016.
That was the moment that confirmed it for everyone in the region, from Vietnam to the Philippines. It showed Beijing was perfectly willing to just ignore international law when it suited them.
The goal was to assert control. The result was?
The result was to turbocharge America's containment strategy. It created huge mistrust and pushed all of its neighbors closer to Washington for security. It was a massive loss of soft power.
Okay, next case, India. That border skirmish in the Galwan Valley in 2020 seems like a huge strategic miscalculation.
A massive one. That conflict led to the first combat deaths between the two countries in decades. It was a turning point. Before that, India had always tried to sort of, balance its relationships.
But the fighting changed everything. What were the actual consequences for China?
They were immediate. India banned hundreds of Chinese apps, they canceled infrastructure deals, they blocked Huawei from their 5G network, and most importantly, from a strategic perspective, India went all in on the Quad alliance with the US, Japan, and Australia.
So they turned a cautious neighbor into an active, committed rival.
Exactly. And then there's Taiwan. This is where the cost of prioritizing face carries the highest possible risk.
The constant military flights, the threats, and at the same time, they're still pushing the one country, two systems idea.
Which has been completely discredited by what's happened in Hong Kong. No one in Taiwan looks at Hong Kong and thinks, yes, I want that. The combination has been a strategic disaster for Beijing.
It's almost like a strategy designed to make peaceful unification impossible.
It's hard to see it any other way. It's pushed Taiwanese public opinion firmly against unification, and it's woken up the neighbors. I mean, you now have Japan openly saying that a conflict over Taiwan would be an existential threat to them. That raises the stakes enormously.
And that leads us to maybe the clearest example of all of this, the failed attempt to use economic coercion against Australia.
Exhibit A. This is the case study for the agent thesis. In 2020, Australia calls for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID.
And Beijing's response is to slap tariffs and restrictions on a whole range of Australian goods: wine, beef, barley, and coal.
It was classic economic bullying. The goal was to punish Australia so badly that no other country would ever dare to cross them again.
But it backfired.
It backfired spectacularly. The damage to Australia's economy was, as analysts put it, relatively modest. They found other markets for their goods, but the damage to China's reputation was immense.
Because it sent a signal to the entire world.
The signal was, doing business with China comes with huge political strings attached. Don't step out of line. And that realization is what accelerated this whole global movement towards de-risking and diversifying supply chains away from China.
And the ultimate irony, the punchline to the whole story, was the coal ban.
Oh, the coup de grace of self-inflicted wounds. In late 2021, China was suffering from widespread power shortages. Factories were shutting down. And a big reason for that was their own self-imposed ban on high-quality Australian coal.
They shot themselves in the foot to prove a point and then complained about the limp.
It makes the aging critique really hard to just dismiss out of hand.
Yeah.
And finally, you have to add in the damage from the prolonged dynamic zero-COVID policy.
Right. Early on, it was seen as a success, but keeping it going for so long.
The severe, extended damage, the random factory shutdowns, the port closures, the exodus of foreign talent and businesses. One critic said it was the kind of damage only an external enemy would wish for.
It just showed that the system couldn't pivot even when the economic costs were becoming astronomical.
It stopped being about public health, and it became about political control, which is the perfect segue into Section 3, the internal logic that drives all of this. The pathologies of what they call Waiwen, or stability maintenance.
Right. This is the gravitational force that pulls every policy back towards control and rigidity.
Waiwen is the single defining logic of governance now. It's not just a line item in a budget. It's this massive, all-encompassing safe China regime. The number one job of every part of the state, from the police to the courts, is to ensure the political security of the party.
And the amount of money they spend on this is just, it's staggering, isn't it?
It is. The spending on internal security, surveillance, social control, it's often compared to the entire national defense budget. Sometimes it's even more. That's a huge amount of resources that could be going to, say, healthcare or fixing that local debt problem.
But it's not just the financial cost. The real damage is what this does to the institutions themselves, the institutional corruption and self-deception it creates.
That's the core of it. When maintaining stability is the only goal that matters, it warps how everything functions. Take the legal system. A court's main job isn't to deliver justice anymore. It's to maintain social stability and stop small problems from becoming big protests.
So a judge's ruling isn't about the law, it's about keeping things quiet.
Right. And this forces local officials everywhere to fudge the numbers, to hide bad news, to only report successes, which means the information flowing up to the top is completely unreliable. It's the Chongzhen problem all over again. The emperor is working hard, but he's working with bad data.
And what happens to all the legitimate social problems, the grievances? If you seal all the steam valves, where does the pressure go?
It just builds. This is the paradox of the state as a risk accumulator. You get short-term quiet by shutting down all the ways people can vent their frustrations, NGOs, civil society groups, public debate.
So by cracking down so hard on any small sign of dissent, you're actually making the whole system less stable in the long run.
It's what the data shows from studies of other authoritarian systems. If you only ever suppress dissent, instead of solving the underlying problems, corruption, unemployment, whatever it is, the pressure just accumulates. And then if the system ever does falter, maybe because of a big economic shock, the explosion is much, much worse.
They're trading a series of small, manageable fires for the risk of a single catastrophic inferno down the line.
That's the vulnerability. The system has no tolerance for criticism, which means it has no ability to self-correct. And that's most dangerous when your economic foundation is already weak.
Okay, so that sets the stage perfectly. We've established the system has these deep-seated problems. Now for the question everyone wants the answer to. Does this mean total economic collapse is just around the corner? Let's talk about the 3-year outlook, from now through the end of 2028.
Right. And to do this, we have to be disciplined and look at what the major international bodies are saying, the IMF, the World Bank, and also respected private firms like the Rhodium Group. We need an objective baseline.
So what's the general consensus on the risk of a full-on systemic collapse?
The consensus is pretty firm on this. The probability of a true systemic collapse, we're talking negative GDP, a complete financial meltdown, widespread social chaos in the next 3 years is very low.
How low?
It's consistently in the extreme tail risk category, less than 5 to 10%. The system has major cracks, but it's not about to shatter overnight like the Soviet Union did.
Okay, so the dramatic headlines are probably overblown, but you said there's a real danger. What does that look like?
The real danger, and the probability here is much higher, is a severe recession or a major financial crisis. Think a regional banking crisis that spreads, or a debt crisis that seriously rattles global markets. Most analysts put the risk of that scenario in the 20 to 35% range.
20 to 35%, that's not a tail risk. That's a very real possibility.
It is. That's the scenario that could lead to years of flat or zero growth and a lot of economic pain.
Okay, but to be fair, we have to ask, why hasn't it collapsed already? What are the resilience factors that are holding things together?
Good question. First, despite all the problems, the big institutions still project positive growth. The IMF, for instance, is forecasting around 4.8% growth for 2025. It's slowing down, but the world does not see China's economy shrinking just yet.
And the government has tools that, a Western government just doesn't have.
They have a huge toolbox. They still have large foreign currency reserves. They can order state banks to lend. They can mobilize massive state resources for stimulus. And critically, they have ironclad capital controls that can stop money from fleeing the country en masse. They can force an ordered restructuring instead of a chaotic collapse.
And the economy isn't just real estate and construction anymore, right?
Not at all. This is a huge point. China is a world leader in key modern sectors. We're talking AI, electric vehicles, EV exports. We're up something like 70% year over year recently. Batteries, solar panels. These high-tech, export-driven industries are providing a vital cushion. They accounted for maybe 40% of GDP growth in 2024.
Okay, so there are strengths. But what are the triggers? What are the black swans that could push that 20-35% crisis risk up closer to 50%?
The biggest risk, without a doubt, is still the real estate and local government debt bomb. The key trigger would be a disorderly default of a huge developer that's seen as safer than Evergrande, maybe a company like Vanke.
Because if a state-backed giant like that goes down,
it would cause an immediate panic in the banking system. It could trigger a full-blown crisis in those local government financing platforms, the LGFEs. That's the nightmare scenario.
And what about the slower-moving threats, the structural problems?
Demographics. This is the big one. China is, as they say, getting old before it gets rich. A rapidly aging population, a shrinking workforce, a fertility rate that's cratered to below 1.1. These things don't cause a crisis tomorrow, but they act like a boa constrictor on long-term growth.
And then there's the external pressure, geopolitical friction.
The U.S.-China trade war and the whole decoupling trend, that's a major variable. The risk of that conflict escalating and knocking a couple of points off China's GDP growth is pretty significant, maybe 25 to 40%. So if you get an external shock hitting at the same time as a major internal debt crisis,
then the odds of that severe crisis scenario go way up.
They jump into that 30 to 50% range very quickly.
Okay, this is where we need to make it really practical for people listening. Let's break down the different scenarios for the next 3 years so we know what to watch for.
Okay, first, the most likely outcome. We'll call it the baseline scenario. We'd put the probability of this at 60 to 75%.
And what does the baseline look like?
It looks like muddling through. Growth slows to that 2 to 4% range. It's a long, painful process of deleveraging, but it's managed. Beijing uses targeted stimulus, a bit of infrastructure spending here, a local debt swap there, to keep the system from falling off a cliff. The economy underperforms for years, but it doesn't collapse.
Okay, that's the baseline. Then there's a high-risk one, the adverse scenario. That's the 20-35% probability.
This is where things get ugly. You see mass property defaults, much bigger than Evergrande. This triggers a credit shock. You can see runs on regional banks. The economy grinds to a halt, hitting zero or even negative growth for a year or two.
And in that scenario, Beijing would have to step in with overwhelming force.
No choice. They'd have to abandon their reluctance and flood the system with money. We're talking nationalizing failed companies, restructuring banks, massive fiscal transfers. It would be incredibly painful in the short term, inflation, volatility, but they would use the full power of the state to prevent a total meltdown.
And finally, the black swan. The extreme collapse scenario. Less than 5–10% chance.
For this to happen, you need everything to go wrong at once. The housing and debt crisis has to collide with a full-blown currency crisis, massive, unstoppable capital flight. And on top of that, a complete breakdown of political and social trust, leading to widespread, coordinated unrest.
Which, given the state's control and surveillance, is why analysts see it as a very remote possibility.
Exactly. It's a tail risk, but it's the one that political instability could lead to.
So really, the immediate question isn't if they collapse, it's how well they can manage this painful slowdown. To track that, what are the specific quantifiable indicators we should all be watching? You can't just trust the headline GDP number.
No, you have to look under the hood. Let's start with financial indicators.
Okay, what tells you the markets are getting scared?
Watch the exchange rate. Specifically, the gap and the volatility between the onshore and the offshore yuan. If the yuan starts to fall fast and bounce around wildly, that's a huge red flag for capital flight. Also, watch the interbank lending rates, what they call SHIBOR. A sudden spike there means the banks don't trust each other anymore, which is the start of a credit freeze.
Okay, and then the epicenter of the crisis. Real estate.
Right. And you have to get granular. Forget the national average price. Look at monthly price changes in the big Tier 1 cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen. But even more important, look at the smaller Tier 3 cities because that's where the LGFV debt is concentrated. And track the debt of the big developers. The credit rating of a company like Vanke is a critical leading indicator. If Vanke gets into real trouble, the adverse scenario becomes much more likely instantly.
And what about the real economy, the social side of things?
The youth unemployment rate. That is a crucial social barometer. If it stays stubbornly high, it tells you the economy isn't creating new jobs and there's a real risk of social instability.
Right.
Also, watch retail sales and the actual flow of credit. If the government is pumping in money but nobody is borrowing or spending it, that's a classic liquidity trap. It means policy isn't working anymore.
And finally, policy itself.
You need to track the flow of foreign direct investment. Is it still leaving the country? And watch what kind of stimulus Beijing is announcing. Is it just small, targeted stuff? Or are they finally announcing the big, painful structural reforms like a real plan to fix the LGFV mess? That would be a signal that they're finally willing to sacrifice some political control for economic stability.
And that's the ultimate test of the whole agent thesis, isn't it? That choice between control and reform.
It is the defining question. The reason that satire is so powerful isn't because anyone really thinks the leader is a spy. It's because it highlights this consistent pattern of choosing political control and national prestige over pragmatic economic health. The risk isn't sabotage. It's a rigid system that can't correct its own mistakes when its legitimacy is on the line.
So if the priority remains stability maintenance and political face above all else, then the risk of that adverse scenario stays high.
The lesson of history from the Chongzhen Emperor onwards is crystal clear. Centralization is a powerful tool when your direction is right. But when your direction is wrong and you've removed all the feedback mechanisms, it just helps you get to the disaster faster.
The entire country's future, then, really hinges on whether the leadership is willing to give up some of that centralized power to make the painful changes needed to restore confidence.
That sacrifice is the only thing that can truly lower the odds of that 20 to 35% crisis scenario becoming a reality.
Well, thank you for breaking all of that down. We hope this gives all of you listening a clearer, more practical way to understand the risks and the outlook for the next 3 years.
Remember, understanding why a system might fail is just as important as predicting when.
We really encourage you to subscribe to the Sip&Talk podcast and also to our good friend Micky's YouTube channel, Micky to Life. He's got a lot of fun stuff. I think his wine tasting videos are on pause for now, but I have it on good authority that he's still sneaking a drink now and then despite his stomach problems. We'll see you all next time.